Building on a fragile ceasefire, the UN envoy to Syria lays the groundwork for yet another round of talks. But are conditions right for peace? And will the talks stall over the fate of President Bashar al-Assad? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Well, the fragile truce in Syria is now into its second week. And to the surprise of many, the ceasefire is largely being respected. The United Nations has been able to deliver aid to around 20,000 people in eastern Syria. More than 20 trucks carried food and medical supplies to citizens living in besieged towns. UN workers hope the truce will continue long enough for them to reach another 100,000 people who need aid. Opposition supporters are also grateful for the break in fighting. They used it to hold large anti-government protests, the first to be held in years. At the same time, at least 135 people were killed in areas which were supposed to be covered by the truce. The opposition blames the government.
In the 7 days since the ceasefire was called, the regime and their allies, notably the Russian Air Force and the regime, along with Iranians and their militias and mercenaries, have been responsible for several massacres. There have been more than 90 airstrikes from the Russian and Syrian Air Force. They've used missiles, cluster bombs, and chlorine gas. They've targeted more than 50 locations in Syria and liberated areas where the opposition, who has accepted the ceasefire, has control. They've targeted those who accepted the ceasefire agreement.
Well, the dispute, even in the midst of a truce, is evidence that the Syrian civil war is far from over. Talks to end the fighting failed in January. The UN envoy to Syria gearing up for round two, set to begin next week. Well, as with previous talks, they largely hinge on the future of President Bashar al-Assad. Saudi Arabia is adamant he must go. The Foreign Minister Adel al-Jubeir said Assad has to leave at the beginning of the process. There is a transitional body, power shifts from Assad to the transitional body, and then he goes. Let's bring our guests into the show now. We have in Moscow Vladimir Mikheev, independent analyst with the Troika Report project. In London, Julien Barnes-Dacey, Senior Policy Fellow in the Middle East and North Africa Programme for the European Council on Foreign Relations. And in Abu Dhabi via Skype, Monzer Akbik, a member of the Syrian National Coalition. Welcome to you all. If we could start with Vladimir then. The UN envoy seems to think that talks will start on Thursday. Do you?
Well, in the case of any civil war, you would certainly have on your hands is the accumulated wrath, animosity, and the bloody vendetta. Actually, it's very hard to overstep it. Definitely, with 4 years down the road of a civil war in Syria, there is a lot of, let's say, very angst, a lot of ill feelings on both sides. Definitely, it's difficult to patch up and to bridge the gap of misconfidence, I would say, just in one leap. Fortunately, I would say that the ceasefire is acting as sort of a positive catalyst, at least to set the ground, to set the stage for productive inter-Syrian dialogue. Now, at least both sides are talking about it. At least it's not about, once again, trying to get the upper hand on the battlefield, but trying to find a certain compromise at the negotiation table. Well, after all, I would say it's much better than it was before, than 4 years ago. After all, I would say we should remember Winston Churchill. He used to say, it's better jaw than war. So in general, I think things can be moving in the right direction, especially as you mentioned before. The ceasefire is in its second week, and many are observing it, despite, as I mentioned from the very start, a lot of ill feelings, mutual accusations, and a lot
sorry,
of
hang on, Vladimir.
distrust.
It's not just about ill feelings. That's always going to be there in a conflict. Doesn't some groundwork need to be done in terms of making sure the ceasefire is holding, that enough aid is being distributed, that people aren't living under siege and being starved to death, and so on and so forth?
Oh, definitely. After all, it's all about a humanitarian catastrophe that is in the 5th year. And I believe it's also one of the reasons is that we actually believe that we should set the stage, I mean, that the position of Moscow as part of all the group of friends of Syria, that we should start the ball rolling. The process of conflict resolution is very complicated. It's
Right.
never smooth, it's always bumpy, and it certainly goes through certain stages. Now we are certainly at ground zero. That's probably the first stage, but there are certain cautious indicators that we might go further on.
OK, let's bring Monzer into the discussion then. The ball is rolling, Vladimir says. Why doesn't the opposition want to roll with it, or is cautious about rolling with it when it comes to peace talks, Monzer?
For a very obvious reasons, that the dictators, they don't go like this on the negotiation table. We have many historical examples of that. Here in the region, we have Gaddafi, we have Saddam Hussein. Assad waged a war against the people because he doesn't want to change. He doesn't want to end the dictatorship and move into a democratic state. And he is continuing with that war. The only way that Assad will leave power is either by military defeat, or his backers in Russia and Iran will tell him to leave the office. Otherwise, if it is left to Assad, he is not going to give any concessions on the negotiating table. Nevertheless, the opposition participated in the beginning of 2014 in Geneva process, accepted the Geneva communique, which states that the country has to move into a political transition toward democracy, and also participated a couple of months ago with Geneva. I think that now in March, the opposition may go and participate in Geneva, but we are not very optimistic that this process is going to lead anywhere without a real leverage that will push Assad out of power.
Might not that come through talks, Monzer? The backers, the argument goes for those who believe in this process, that the backers might reach that, the backers of Bashar al-Assad might reach that point where they say, well, he really needs to go, and this peace talks and this process needs to be taken to the next stage.
Well, we haven't seen that from them yet, because you have seen that in the past few months, the Russians, they started a direct intervention, military intervention, starting from 30th of September last year, and started bombing the opposition and bombing the civilians in favor of improving Assad's military position on the ground. The Iranians are doubling down also, and they're sending a lot of their Revolutionary Guard and their proxy militias and fighting for Assad. So the escalation, military escalation of Assad backers against the opposition does not indicate that they are ready yet to let go of Assad. But at the same time, what they are saying in Vienna and they are saying in Geneva, that they are with the political solution and political transition. So we are seeing some kind of contradiction between what they say and what they do.
All right, Julien, this whole round of conditional ceasefire, resumption of talks has come as a result of some common ground being found between the US and Russia. Does that common ground extend to enough of a common vision on how to translate this conditional, shaky, battered ceasefire into something more long-term and long-lasting between world powers?
Well, I think, as you say, there has been some common alignment of late between the Russians and the Americans, and I think that's been around the priority of de-escalating the violence, of trying to turn down the volume of the conflict that we've seen raging for 5 years now. I don't think that extends to what a political solution looks like. As Mr. Akbik was saying, the opposition and most of its backers very much remain in a place that Assad has to go, and has to go soon. For the Russians and for the Iranians,
the world powers, the United States, Julien, haven't they sort of, shall we not say back down on that demand, but are not so vocal anymore on that point?
Absolutely. The Americans are backing off, but the Europeans and the regionals are not in that place yet. We've seen today the Saudi Arabian foreign minister came out saying that Assad has to go at the start of the process. Turkey remains very much in a similar place, as does France, at least saying that even if he doesn't leave on day one, there has to be an agreement on day one that at the end of this political process, he's going to leave. And for the Russians and the for the Russians and the Iranians, as for the regime, that is not an option on the table. They are perhaps willing to think about diluting some of Assad's powers, talking about constitutional reforms, but they're not willing to sign off on something that says that Assad must go. So I think, yes, we are still stuck. The Americans may be willing to do more. The Americans may be willing to do more compromises in terms of the question of Assad, but they can't bring their own allies, they can't bring the opposition on board. So I think the focus of these initial talks is going to be about trying to sustain the ceasefire, trying to keep open these new avenues of humanitarian space that have just emerged, and try to slowly build some consensus around the political process. But that's unlikely to be an end game, and I think what we're really looking at is confidence-building measures, is about trying to draw the two sides into a dialogue, create some momentum around which they can try and create a political process. But to my mind, that is going to have to be based on the assumption that Assad is staying around for some time, because as Mr. Akbik correctly said, the only way to get around that is either the opposition's back, the regime's back is pushed in, which they're not willing to do, or some kind of military intervention, which also remains off the table. So Assad is not going anywhere, and I think the political process is going to have to work on that basis.
Interesting. Well, Vladimir, if, as you were saying, the goal of this process now is to get the ball rolling, to get talks going, and to get the sides out of the mindset of trying to dominate or defeat the other side militarily, why then is Russia continuing with airstrikes, as well as the Syrian regime? They're both accused of continuing airstrikes after the ceasefire has begun on areas and groups which are supposed to be covered by the truce.
I haven't seen any substantiated fact that prove this point. It's just one another accusations that has been, let's say, voiced from the very beginning of the Russian involvement in the Syrian war.
Sorry, sir, forgive me for interrupting. Have you not seen the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reporting airstrikes on Duma, for example, on March the 4th? Duma is held by a group, Jaish al-Assad, which is part of the HNC, which is signed up.
The very first reports that Russian airstrikes has actually led to casualties of the civilians have actually appeared in Western online editions even before the Russian jets have taken off the tarmac. That's to begin with. Second, each of these cases should be actually substantiated by hardcore proved facts. Of course, it could have happened because, after all, as you know, the terrain there is very patchy. It's so patchy, for instance, that it's very difficult to distinguish where the one territory controlled by one group of radical Islamists ends and starts another territory controlled by what might be called moderate Syrian opposition. Russia has actually approached the United States to actually give for the maps to be provided to them so they do actually pinpoint and target the exact enemies, that is the terrorists or jihadist groups. It hasn't been actually realized because the United States actually refused to cooperate with Russia on this point. Talking about the continuation of airstrikes, according to the agreement on the ceasefire, Russia and the United States, or shall we say the US-led coalition, has reserved the right to continue airstrike against the terrorist organizations who are holding territories there in Syria, that is Jabhat al-Nusra and Daesh, or ISIS, and this is continuing.
Yeah, sorry, Vladimir,
in any suspicion, let's say, or accusation that Russian strikes are aimed to support Bashar al-Assad, once again, it should be proved.
What you're saying then is basically the Russian military doesn't have proper maps in Syria to know where these groups are, and yet the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, social media websites, I mean, a lot of organizations, human rights websites, Human Rights Watch, they all seem to be able to differentiate where civilians are or where groups, as you call them, like the ISILs, the Jabhat al-Nusra are versus other groups which have nothing to do with ISIL or Jabhat al-Nusra. How is it that the Russians are lost in Syria?
According to the official statements that have been made by the Russian Minister of Defense, any of the airstrikes against their targets inside Syria are carried out only after all of that have been verified by and supported by intelligence provided by the Syrian army, by intelligence sources based in Iraq, and also through verified by Russian-owned sources, let's say, to prove that they are targeting exactly the terrorist organization and no civilian targets. There are no collateral edges. There could be definitely to some certain extent, but once again, as to use the most popular NATO expression or American expression during the intervention in Iraq or in Afghanistan, that is unfortunate collateral damage.
Unfortunate collateral damage. Monzer Akbik, do you agree with that? The Russians have gone very carefully through the selection of targets. There's no deliberate targeting of civilians or reckless targeting of civilians going on.
No, unfortunately, it is really very unfortunate, and I regret to see that a great nation and a superpower like Russia lying every hour and every day about the targets that they are hitting in Syria. They have never hit ISIS. They hit hospitals. They hit civilian places, marketplaces. They killed thousands of people and moderate opposition. They intervened for favor of Assad. They intervened to prevent Assad from falling in a military way. So and every time we are talking about this, they say you don't have a proof. Okay, let them go now to the United Nations and issue a new resolution asking for third-party observers on the ground. We, as a Syrian opposition, we accept United Nations observer to enter Syria now, and then they will report what Russia is bombing and where they are bombing, and then the Russians, they will not be able
Okay, hang on, Monzer. I'll give you a chance to continue the thought. Forgive me for interrupting you too, but I want to take that point to Vladimir. Why doesn't Russia accept at least observers on the ground? Briefly, sir.
Well, that's not up to me. I think that could be worked out. Definitely, it's one of the options. I think that, after all, accusing any, let's say, a military power, let's say, using of hitting deliberately civilian targets just for the sake of supporting Bashar Assad, I think that's a bit fetch. It's an overstretch.
Okay, with all due respect, Vladimir, my question though was why has Russia blocked so many diplomatic resolutions that were going through the Security Council? Why not accept at least and support a move to install observers, and then you'd be able to verify and know you wouldn't need maps from the Americans,
I think
right?
that would be acceptable. That would be acceptable if it would be a truly unbiased, objective group of observers who would not actually serve the purpose of trying to prove that something that has been just said by one of my colleagues from the Syrian opposition. Well, he certainly was supposed to say what he actually said. That's definitely, because if there were someone in the studio representing, according to the United Nations, let's say, statute, a legitimate government in Damascus, we're just not talking about a dictator Assad, but the legitimate governor of Assad, of a legitimate government in Damascus, I think they would say quite a different story. They present quite a different side of it.
Okay, Monzer, I cut you off, so I'll give you a brief second to finish your thought.
Yeah, as I was saying, now when we are talking about unbiased party that will observe this, the United Nations is, the most eligible party to do that, and the Human Rights Council that belongs to the United Nations, they are said that the Russians are committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria. So Russia does not also consider that United Nations Human Rights Council as an unbiased party. So I would say that the Russians are just denying what it is very obvious to everybody in the world.
If I could move the discussion along, why would the opposition go? You said that you weren't very optimistic about these talks, but you think the opposition are going to end up going. Why would they go to talks if they feel that they're really not leading anywhere? Is it just because you're under pressure?
Of course, the opposition is under pressure, and the opposition...
By who, sir? Who's pressuring the opposition to go to talks that are doomed?
I mean all the countries that are friendly to the Syrian people, the friendly countries to us, which is basically most of the world except Russia and Iran. But there are also a group of countries, which is, they call them the core group of Syria friends, and mostly in the West and the regional countries. And they always ask us to engage in a positive and a serious way, and we always do that. And at the same time, we don't want also to look like, although that we are not optimistic about the results, also we don't want to look like that we are against peace.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, that the Geneva Communique, we agree to each and every word and letter in Geneva Communique.
Right.
It states that Syria should transfer into democratic state. So that's why the platform of the process itself also is to the favor of the Syrian people and the favor of opposition.
Okay.
So that's why we are willing to go.
Okay, Julien, I guess the question then is, if you have one side which is saying we're going to these talks because our backers are putting a lot of pressure on us, is there a vision amongst the backers of the opposition for what they see as the end game of these talks? I mean, if even the backers of these talks, the world powers that created this process, have said they have their doubts about whether this ceasefire is going to hold, what is their vision for the end game of ceasefire-induced talks?
Well, I mean, both the backers of the opposition and of the regime have the same goals here. One is to prove that their side of this battle are the responsible ones, that the opposition here are willing to come to the table to negotiate in good faith, much as the Russians and the Iranians are now saying about the regime, that they're willing to come, and that the talks are going to collapse because of the unwillingness of the other side to engage in real compromises. I think there's also a desire on the part of both sides to test the backers. I think the Europeans and the Americans have a belief that the Russians may be willing to engage in a greater degree of political talks to try and push the regime. I think likewise the Russians think that perhaps the US and the Europeans, in the face of refugees and terrorism, are themselves going to be close to be willing to fold. So I think there's this double game going on of trying to maintain the credibility of one's own side, trying to push the other side to give in. And I think...
Okay, but Julien, is there a vision beyond that?
There's a lot of hope.
It seems at least...
Well, there isn't. No, there isn't. I think that there's a vision of trying to get some kind of process underway, of trying to keep the ball moving, of trying to get the other side to buy into this process. Neither of the two sides are yet willing to accept the fundamental compromises that will be needed to undergird any meaningful peace process. Even if, as you said earlier on, the Americans are moving into a place where Assad can stay for longer than they would like, they are not yet willing to swallow the kind of compromises that the Russians and the Iranians are demanding of them, and likewise when you reverse it. So I think the idea is not to put everything on the table to say this is about the end game, this is about transition, this is about to try and create momentum for a sustainable political process, to create confidence building measures, to simply by moving away from violence, to try and shift the language that is being used on the ground, to open up an alternative space, to build momentum for those forces that are saying against them fighters on both sides, you have to end this, hoping that down the line something new may open up in terms of a new possibility. But I don't think anyone is really investing in a genuine hope that these talks are going to deliver something soon. It's about sustaining a ceasefire, sustaining humanitarian space, and effectively hoping that that will lead somewhere.
And lead to what, though, Julien, briefly in 20 seconds,
well,
in the interim?
I think the need needs to be a solution that is talking about devolving of power, moving power away from the center towards the regions, empowering rebels on the ground, effectively forgetting about the Assad transition question and turning it into a governance question, where effectively Syrians are being able to rule the parts of the country that they control. Perhaps we can get back to the Assad transition question down the line, but that's not something that can be addressed now.
That sounds dangerously close to the partition argument and discussion, which is a whole nother can of worms. I'm afraid we are out of time, Julien, but you know what? I'm sure we'll be back here talking about this very issue in the not too distant future again. So for now, apologies. Let's end the discussion here and thank our guests, Vladimir Mikheev, Julien Barnes-Dacey and Monzer Akbik. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team for now, is goodbye.